This week on the show, Tempo Storm wins the CEVO finals. We take a look at Dreamhack Austin, and Mo has stepped down from Team Echo Fox. I'm Jack Westerman, joined by John Blue Mullen, and you're watching PopFlash. This week's clip is Frag Executives versus Fnatic at IEM 2011, where Neo picks up a pistol ace in the quarter-finals. FX would sweep Fnatic 2-0 before losing to Na'Vi in the grand final. Statistically, Neo would finish as the event's second best player. Our first story this week is the CEVO Gfinity Professional Finals, which took place in London, England, over the course of the last weekend. So, this event, Blue, had 8 teams. Virtus.pro, who were the Season 8 champions. 2 direct invites, who were Tempo Storm and Na'Vi, though Na'Vi had to drop out and were replaced by SK Gaming. And we also had 3 from NA, Optic, Selfless, Splice, and 2 from Europe, Dignitas and Hellraisers. First place prize was $55,000 out of 125, and well, let's get straight into the groups. So, Group A is the one with Hellraisers, Optic, Splice, and Virtus.pro, and let's talk about the American teams here, Blue, because Optic and Splice did not make too much impact. Both failed to advance from the group. Is that to be expected against quality European opponents, or did you see any upsets here?
No, I mean, it's definitely to be expected for the North American teams to drop out that early, so especially when you're looking at teams like Optic and Splice, who have not had that much international exposure.
Yeah.
This would have been Optic's, I think this was Optic's 3rd international event, if I remember correctly, just as this roster in total, not talking about the individual players. And for Splice, maybe their 3rd if you technically count the qualifier and the major itself as 2 separate events. They didn't really get to do that much of the major, but yeah, still not a whole lot of international exposure for these 2 guys, so it's not too surprising to see them sort of decked out pretty early.
Speaking of international experience, so this is Optic's 3rd tournament. How useful is it for these guys to be getting this kind of international experience at tournaments like this?
I mean, it's always good to get that. It's like you can talk about this with the Asian scene too, about how, you know, they finally get to go over, they get to play Europeans. Yeah, they're gonna get probably the lower seeds and they're gonna get decked out in the group stages, but they always get, you know, they get a taste essentially of how the 1st tier and the 2nd tier European teams get to play. Which at the moment there shouldn't really be any contest to decide that they're, you know, gonna be better than them. So the European teams will definitely have the edge over them, and 9 times out of 10 we will see some chance. Well, we will see sometimes, of course, where the higher up North American teams like Liquid and whatnot do get the edge over those guys and make it out of the group stages. And of course, like at the major, sometimes they'll be able to go a little bit further than that. But for the most part, of these guys that have really only played at international lands 2, maybe 3 other times, it would definitely be a big surprise to see them go very, very far in the group stages, especially when they're going up against much tougher teams like this event, specifically Tempo Storm and some of the other bigger European teams that were there.
Do Optic and Splice have the players? Do they have the talent to make this experience worthwhile? I mean, are these rosters that you can take experience and add it to them and they'll become great teams, or do they have to? Are there additional things they need to do as well, if you know what I mean?
I definitely think that there's definitely a lot more required than just the experience. Optic, I do think, should have the raw skill potential, just to, once they actually gain more experience and whatnot, and they can bring themselves together as a team, that yes, they should be able to perform much better against these tier 2 and in some cases tier 1 European teams. Splice is going to require like a lot more. There's a lot more drilling that comes into play there. I mean, they just got rid of their coach recently and whatnot, so they're not really bringing a whole lot of that to the table. But even on an individual basis, there was a lot of very small, minute mistakes that were being made by this team at the event, and that's something that they need to take a look at on their own, not as a team, if they want to have any chance of sort of ascending to that next level.
All right, well, let's leave Group A there. We'll come back and talk about Hellraisers and Virtus.pro, because obviously those 2 teams did advance beyond the group. As we get Group B up on screen, this is the group with Tempo Storm, SK, Dignitas, and Selfless. And straight off the bat, I think it's fair to say Tempo Storm looking pretty strong. They beat SK 2-0 in that first place decider in the top middle. They beat Dignitas 2-1. How impressed should we be by these guys, Blue?
Tempo Storm, I mean, obviously bringing their all to every event, as we've just come to expect now from Brazilian teams. Luminosity was doing the same thing for the longest time, and it was no question that Tempo Storm was going to be doing the same thing too, especially when you consider, I brought this up a couple times before, they live across the goddamn street from Luminosity's team house, so a lot of sharing probably goes on there, just in terms of team strats and like the way that they drill themselves, make themselves a better team too. And I mean, they've already proved themselves in a couple of other events, and it's the same story as Luminosity. They've been slowly rising up, and this was their event where they finally sort of apexed and ended up coming out on top of a lot of the other big teams, like we saw just in their group stage, some of the bigger European teams that were there, a lot of the Danish squads.
Yeah, so, well, of course, they did advance from Group B. The second team to advance was SK, over there on the far right. The other team I want to touch on, though, is Selfless, because this was the third of the 3 American teams, and not such a success story. They lost
No, not at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one way of putting it. Lost to Dignitas 0-2, and then got eliminated by SK 0-2. Any signs of life in this roster?
I mean, it's I'm interested to see how they perform at Austin, because it almost seems like the online Selfless now and the LAN Selfless are two completely different teams. We even saw this back at the major qualifiers too, where they just dropped the ball completely and could not really put too much effort onto the board. Yeah. And at the time, I think myself and a couple of the other analysts thought, well, this is because it was weird with how Kusta was playing, because Kusta had been playing on Liquid at that point for about, I think it was like 3 weeks or a month around there. And when they brought him back, he was like using this completely different play style, especially on Inferno. He had been this aggressive operator before. Now he was being really reserved. He was almost always the last man alive on one of the maps they played on Inferno. And it was very awkward. And everybody thought at that point that it was his fault. But coming into this LAN, I mean, there was just huge inconsistencies across the board for every single player. A lot of the big people that are supposed to be winning 1v1s, like Relics, I think out of the 2 teams they faced and out of the 10 possible 1v1 matchups, Relics, who's normally that guy who's supposed to be winning all the 1v1s for his team, he was only leading, I think, in like 2 out of 10 of them or something along the lines of that. So a lot of inconsistencies across the team. You just look at the scoreboards, these guys were everywhere at every single time. There was no player that really came in and had a solid performance throughout the entire event. So it just seemed like the entirety of Selfless dropped the ball here. And now I'm curious to see how that's going to lean into Austin. If we'll see a repeat of that, then maybe this is just a team that isn't very powerful in a LAN environment at all.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's leave Group B there as well and jump down to the bracket stage. So, as we get this up on screen, it was a pretty straightforward swap over, right? So Group A, B, first and second seed swaps over. So first seed Group A plays second seed Group B and vice versa. So we ended up with Hellraisers versus SK, which was a bit of a blowout, versus Pro versus Tempo Storm. And, well, first off, let's talk about VP and Tempo, because that was a hell of a series. 3 maps to 2. Tempo obviously won the first 2. VP answered right back, and then in that deciding 5th game, Tempo took the whole thing. That was on their way to the grand final, where they beat SK Gaming 3-1, and we've already talked about Tempo Storm, but I think it's fair to say they held their nerve even as the competition kind of stepped up here in the bracket stage as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fair to say. Like I said before, obviously bringing their best to the stage here as far as it's concerned. A lot of that raw talent coming out once again, fighting probably the tough battle, which was, in my opinion, against Virtus Pro there, as over the past couple of months they had not been looking so strong, but with, as we all know, Virtus Pro and how inconsistent they can be. In 1 month, they're kicking some serious ass, in the next month, well, a couple of months in the recent case, we weren't seeing much of them. But now they came back. They were looking like, in all honesty, I thought they were going to be taking this event over Tempo Storm. But at the end of the day, they ended up winning that set, just barely clinched it. And then in the finals versus SK, although SK did put up a better fight, I think it's safe to say that Tempo Storm were definitely the better team there.
Yeah, just on SK as well. So these guys finished in second place, 3-1 behind Tempo Storm, but not exactly a bad tournament. They only lost maps to Tempo Storm. They lost to them in the group stage and here in the final. Didn't drop anything to anybody else. Was this just a case of a bad matchup for SK?
I think I would argue to say it could be bad matchup, and then looking at it too, probably a case of them not really having proper preparation to be going up. Be going up against Tempo Storm there. A lot of the other games, a lot of the other teams that they do end up facing there. Obviously, they faced Tempo Storm previously to that one, and they end up dropping that one pretty handily. But then they go up against Selfless, who we already talked about. Selfless weren't really putting up a fight, so preparation was not an issue. Hellraisers, I'm sure they faced them plenty of times, so they knew how to play that team inside and out. But then they go up against Tempo Storm again, and despite the fact they already played them in 2 maps, it didn't really seem like we saw that much adjustment. And unfortunately, they fell to them once again there in the finals.
For our second story this week, we're going to be taking a look at Dreamhack Open Austin, which takes place, as you might expect, in Austin, Texas, between May 6th and 8th. Now, Blue, this is a $100,000 tournament. We've got 8 teams all competing for this prize money. And as we have a look at Group A, we'll see this is Luminosity, Splice, Counterlogic, and Cloud9. Pretty stacked group.
Yeah, definitely. Rip Splice right off the bat. Not to be too harsh about it, but in all honesty, especially with how they're coming off of CEVO, I think that their only chance to make it through would be to fight against CLG. But even in CLG's case, I would argue that they've been coming up from a recent slump as of late, and I still think that they're going to have the edge in that matchup. But there is a chance to them. It would just be against CLG. I don't think they have any chance at all versus Luminosity. I would say Cloud9 to beat CLG easily there. And although the first place decider match is up in the air, Splice would have to beat through CLG and then beat either Luminosity or Cloud9. More than likely Cloud9 to make it out, which is just a tough run in general for those guys.
You say Cloud9 over CLG. Well, these are two rosters that have both been up and down. Both kind of, well, Cloud9's had their big roster change, of course. The Freakazoid is no longer playing with them. What makes you say Cloud9 over CLG in this instance, given their track records?
I still think in terms of just a raw talent marker, as well as the way that the team is disciplined overall, is way better than CLG. CLG is an incredibly inconsistent team. Used to be fairly consistent, to be completely honest, but that's not really the case anymore. And I know this is like a really cliche thing to say, but I've like, especially if you just watch all of CLG's matches, the ones that they lose or win by a very big margin, this is a team that, in my opinion, is incredibly momentum based in the way they play their game. If they hit the ground running, they win the first like 5 or 6 rounds in a row. And yes, they're going to be a very tough team to shut down later on in that matchup if the opposing team can even come back at that point. But if they start off slow, it's very unlikely that they're ever going to bounce back to a convincing scoreline. A little bit different in North American matches as they tend to be a bit closer, but overall that just tends to be the way that CLG's games always play out.
All right, well, let's leave Group B, jump down to, Group A, and move down to Group B. This is the group, once again, we've got one Brazilian team mixed in here, Tempo Storm at the top, and then NRG, Team Liquid, and Selphus. So, we talked about Freakazoid leaving Cloud9, but we've also got Liquid in here, who, of course, are playing with their reshuffled roster. Presumably, we should expect them to be a little bit rusty while they get over that post-simple slump.
Actually, I don't really know about that, especially at least in the group stage. Like watching their last couple of games, the ESL Pro League didn't really look like it was the case. Couple bumps here and there, but for the most part, it still looked like Liquid was actually fairly strong. I definitely think it's not going to be as strong of a team, but especially when you consider that all of the other talent at this event is going to be either North American or South American. I still think that they'll have a fairly strong chance to, at the very least, make it out of this group and make it fairly far through the actual playoff stage as well. The Dren's still been looking perfectly fine coming off the major performance. I think in general, ever since you take a Dren off that IGL role, he's been playing perfectly fine. Whereas with some of the other guys that are going to be in this group, Energy, Energy and Tempo Storm will be a very good match to watch. Selfless again, coming in from that last event, unless that we see some major changes, I still think that they're going to be the first team to get knocked out here. And then from there, it's just that three-way battle to make it out. But I still think Team Liquid holds a slight edge, at least for second place. Them and Tempo Storm is probably going to be my top 2 picks for that group.
So I guess it's fair to say we could expect an all-Brazilian final.
Very, very possible. Definitely possible indeed.
If you had to bet, just last question on this before we move on. If you had to bet your skins or whatever you play with, who would your top 3 for the event be?
Personally, I would go, at this current state and time, LG first, with Tempo Storm second, and then either somewhere in the mix there, I would actually put Cloud9 third over Team Liquid. And I didn't talk too much about this earlier when we brought them up, but another reason as to why I'm thinking Cloud9 is coming back now too is because of the fact that we've seen a lot of individual improvements and a lot of these guys sort of stepping up. They're playing a lot more CS. I think it was talked about with Skadoodle recently too. If you look at his hours played, it's gone up like immensely in Counter-Strike. Yeah. Not just really logging in for the games and scrims anymore. He's actually playing a lot more on his own to bring his own game up. And I think he's trying to get himself back into that monster shape that he was back last summer, just under a year ago at this point. And with Shroud still performing very well, nothing maybe looking a bit better now that he doesn't have to worry about the IGL role. I'm still a bit worried about how Slemmy's going to play out considering the inexperience that he brings to the table, but not going to judge him as of yet. We'll have to wait and see at these next couple of lands how he does end up performing in that role.
Last but not least, I've got some quick-fire questions for you, Blue. So, quick as you can, give me your thoughts on the following news stories from the week. First off the bat, Mo has stepped down from Team Echo Fox, and Shazam has stepped in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was sort of to be expected. The problem with Mo, and I mean, the same thing sort of happened with Summit too. We didn't bring that up in the last segment, but that'll be interesting too. Not going to speculate too much on that because we are at quickfire. But like Mo's got streamer fever, I think, where it's more like, yeah, I could go pro, but I could also stream and just do that.
Yeah.
And I think that comes into play there too. Not only this too, but I think when you look at Shazam's not really going to have like attention divided between those two things. And now that he's open, being kicked off of Optic, I think he's going to be a much better option in the long run overall. Also, interesting note, this brings back I think like 3 to 5 of the old Tempo Storm roster back from last summer, which actually wasn't that bad of a team. If I remember correctly, I think they got pretty close to qualifying for ESL 1 Cologne back there, but got beat up by either CLG or C9, one of those two. And now they have the leadership of Sean Garris like behind them, so that could be a pretty good team in the long run. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. All eyes on that roster. And second this week, we've got the Asia Minor Qualifiers, which take place between May 5th and 8th.
And that's going to be a fun one, too, because a lot of the competition in Asia have been stepping up recently, especially with more of the Australian teams starting to bring their own game up. Renegades actually could be in potential to not make it in this time, too. If I remember correctly, I think that these teams will get... I think that the top 2 teams of this one actually go into the qualifier for the major this time. Might have gone down to 1, but if it's the same as the last circuit when MLG was running it, I'm pretty sure it's 2. So it's going to be a tough one, especially with these Chinese teams. Tyloo most notably having their really good run back at Malmo there, and the Mongols as well being able to make it out last time, then having the unfortunate visa issues. I'm sure they're going to be just as willing to make it in this time too, and be able to actually make it through into the event itself. So it's going to be a very, very tough matchup, and you'll be definitely wanting to check that out as well between that and Austin.
That's it for this week. I'm Jack Westerman, joined by John Blue Mullen.
And we'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of PopFlash.